Hi guys and welcome back to Rage Gaming. My name is Solo and today we're going to talk more Stories 2. Last time I went through every monster we had confirmed pre-demo, but now with the demo and various interviews we have some new information to talk about. As someone who hadn't played the original, I wanted to learn about the new features that were coming in this sequel, what they were and why they were important. After I did that, I could see a clear change between the original and the sequel in how the game is actually going from more of an action-adventure to a more involved, deeper JRPG game, and I find that very promising. These updates, additions, and improvements come together to add new depth to the gameplay so that we have more choice with greater relevance. Importantly, most of these changes do actually come from feedback from the player base, explained through interviews with the lead producer, Ryozo Tsushimoto, which is really nice to hear. So here's 5 updates and changes in Stories 2 that I think will greatly improve the series. First up, I want to talk about the newly improved Rite of Channeling, that mechanic that lets you alter the skills and even elements of your monsters, able to create completely new versions of them and changing the way we actually approach team building. While we did see this in the original, it has been changed in 2 main ways that are really important. Firstly, it was almost entirely excluded and restricted during the story playthrough of the original game, something you actually had very little access to unless you completed the game and continued to play post-story. That was because of stimulants, which were required to properly use the rite. In the original, they were extremely rare until post-story, and it was common for a lot of players to fall off after they finished the story and never properly experience this mechanic. So in Stories 2, the pacing of the Rite of Channeling has been better thought out. This time we're actually going to have access to stimulants the moment we unlock the Rite of Channeling, and that's going to be nice and early in the second chapter of the game. On top of that, they're going to be directly farmable. You'll need to trade bottle caps for stimulants, which can actually be farmed in evidence found throughout the game. So we should see many more players having the opportunity to try the Rite system and go crazy with it. If they want to create very unique monsters and just farm stimulants like mad, well, they can. On top of that, the effect of Rite of Channeling is even better. Less restricted. The main limit of the original was how you couldn't transfer genes to all unlocked slots, essentially limiting the potential of the monster hybrids. Now we can transfer genes to any slot we've unlocked, and you can do it early. There's those clips of Azuras being the avatar of elements, the Fated 4 in just one bear. And just as the website explains, you could be making monsters that are jacks of all trades, so able to swap between all of it, power, speed, and technical skills. Or create specialists, like our fire specialist, whose fire element abilities have all been heavily upgraded, so it's perfect to bring that one out at the right moment. So I think the Rite of Channeling sounds like a really fun way to give players the ability to pick, say, their favorite monsters and then create their ideal party and make it functionally viable through the channeling rite. So if you're willing to put the effort in, you can have your perfect ideal team, which I think is a good thing to have as a long-term personal goal for players. Next up then, the new weapons, because yeah, there is 2 new weapons, but the original 4 have a very different mechanic change too. So not only do we have 2 new weapons in the gun, lance and bow, but that original 4 have that new and important concept to consider: part breaking, which should add a new layer to the combat and more options to consider. The weapons will all fall under 3 types of damage, which will be blunt, pierce, and slash. So we have 2 weapons for each. Hammer and hunting horn are for a blunt. We've got S&S and greatsword for your slash damage, and newly gun, lance, and bow as your pierce options. I'll go over the new part break stuff and the importance of that later on, but essentially it raises the value of each weapon and why you would choose to bring it against specific monsters. Specifically though, let's talk about what the new weapons are and how they work. Firstly, we have the gun lance, which comes with its own meter to consider, the shells. We build this up in various ways. One is the passive gain of 1 shell per turn, but we can also get shells through critical hits and winning clashes. Shells are the weapon's builder spender, various skills costing different amounts of shells to perform, which is standard for the weapons. But the gun lance has that awesome Wyvern fire skill, which can actually only be used after building up your kinship gauge to full. Normally players would use that to mount your monster, but in the case of the gun lance, we can spend it all for that very strong Wyvern fire attack instead. Beautifully, Wyvern fire won't consume any shells either, which is very nice. But all in all, the gun lance has a lot of options when it comes to attacks based on what shell count you do have, and of course the unique super ability compared to the other weapons. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we have the bow, which has that familiar mechanic from the main series: coatings. Coatings will also function as skills, giving us extra options during combat, all dependent on which bow you currently have and which coatings come with that weapon specifically. All bows will come with the basic attacks of standard shots and charge shots. Charge shots will cost you nothing but do consume your turn, but those charge shots are very important, kind of like the greatsword effect, since when you do these it builds meter and then in turn that lets you use your strongest moves. These are your spread, pierce or rapid shots, which again, like the main series weapon, does depend on which bow you have to choose which you can actually do. The types of charge shots are important to consider. Spread is like an AoE, hit all enemies at once. Rapid is the strong single shots, and pierce is of course ideal against specific monster parts. A fun bonus of the bow though, for all of them, is how when you do charge a shot, you might have a power shot effect, which is a fun mechanic because it basically reimburses you for the turns you spent charging earlier. But these two work to add suitable pierce weapon options for your loadout, both being very versatile. Let's now move on to a very important update. Based on player feedback, the consistent attack patterns we're going to find in the game now. As this is a Pokemon-inspired take on Monster Hunter, we're dealing with a turn-based strategy game that involves strengths and weaknesses that you should try to use to your advantage. The devs reported a lot of feedback about the original's combat that kind of went against this core concept, the point of the game, resulting in RNG aspects. Apparently, there was a randomized element where monsters could actually act atypical in response to patterns. So even when you made all the right choices, the monster might just swap its attack type without a clear tell, which could result in damage you weren't really able to avoid, even when playing in a fairly optimal way. To me, that sounds really frustrating, and it's good to hear that the devs are taking on board such important feedback and making this change. Now the monsters are going to be more consistent, using attack types of their type, which in result gives us much better odds when playing around what that monster actually should be doing. And while that might come across as sounding much more easier mechanically and less punishing, they're actually aware of that and they've made other changes to the gameplay to keep the challenge. This comes in the form of their different battle actions, like as an example, a monster could be attacking you with power attacks, but then changes the situation to a new attack type. But you're given a sort of visual warning, you're aware that things are changing, so you can react properly. Maybe the monster just burrowed, or now they're in the air, so they're airborne. In either case, they're attacking in a new way, but it's clearer. You know the changes occurred, and you can react to it. If a monster has swapped from technical to power, due to say it being in a rage state, you might want to swap to a speed monster to counter it. It's clear what's happening, you have your tactical choices to make in the moment, and that can gain you the advantage. But buffing up the combat mechanics further, we also have part breaking, which I said I'd talk about. Newly introduced to stories, the added layer to the combat, and of course your equipment choices, is part breaking. Just like the main series, part breaking is an important aspect not only for loot, where you say cut off a tail to maybe get the tail, but also making the fight easier, since hey, the monster has reduced range because its tail has been cut off. Here it is much more mechanically relevant, removing monsters' abilities entirely, leaning further into that whole playing around strengths and weaknesses. Maybe in the past you'd bring a power monster to fight a technical monster, but now you also want to consider what weapons you're bringing. You'll need to think about what kind of monster you're dealing with, and whether you need to be bringing a blunt, pierce, or slash weapon to effectively part break. The result of a part break is just like the main series, but even better. Of course, breaking apart does reward important materials to use in upgrading, but in the fight, it could result in a knockdown stun or completely remove certain abilities from that monster's moveset, both of which are a huge advantage in the fight. And since we can have up to 3 weapons equipped at once, we can basically be ready for anything. And with the 6 weapons total, we have 2 choices on each of the types to pick between. And even more importantly, depending on the weapon type you're actually using and what enemy you're fighting, monsters could actually take less damage because they're resistant to that damage type. All weapons on any attack that you do will deal the base damage of that weapon, so a slashing weapon will always do slashing damage. In the case that you see a red line through the weapon damage you're doing, that will show that you're actually doing less damage there. But on the other hand, if the monster is weak to that weapon damage type, you'll see a white glow around it, and that will be, I would assume, extra damage. So lots of good added depth to the combat. Now let's talk about the biggest criticism and most noticeable change between the first and second game. This is the aged up characters, monsters, and world. According to the lead producer, Ryozu, the #1 criticism they received was about the proportions of the characters and the overall childish feel. He explained that the original choice of the chibi art style with the very young characters was to actually appeal to a wider audience. And unfortunately, it seems like it backfired on them. The result was a lot of feedback from adult players who felt like it was just a bit too much. And as it turned out, adults were the main audience for the original game, which makes sense, right? While kids certainly can play the Monster Hunter series, I would say there's a massive amount of adults playing it, obviously. And since they're already interested in Monster Hunter, you could imagine in turn they would be interested in the new Stories IP and that take on the series. And while I can personally appreciate the younger style and how that sure might appeal to younger players, I think this is just a better visual choice. It's still bright and colourful, it's still charming in a way that I think will appeal to kids like they originally wanted, but this much more adult style of course opens the door to an older audience better. We're closer to the original concepts of the world, of the monsters, and I prefer that too. And it all ties well with the more involved gameplay mechanics, since this is an almost genre-changing update to the series. But in conclusion then, I feel Stories 2 is looking very promising and more engaging long-term as a game compared to what I've learned about the original, thanks to the combination of these additions. The less restrictive Rite of Channeling means we can be much more creative with our parties and monsters themselves sooner. The whole new layer to the combat in both part breaking, with the weapons that you need to choose to be more relevant to the fight you're in, which of course made it more important for them to give us more options with weapons with the addition of the bow and gun lance. The core combat will be much more logical based on the newly improved consistent attack patterns that make sense based on what the monster is currently doing or what state it's in. So while the visuals are certainly more adult, I think the core combat is the main improvement that's going to benefit all players long term. If the game is more complicated with more options, we all have a lot more to enjoy in that post-story section. It really seems like we're going from a simplistic monster Pokemon game to more of a JRPG with its own elements to think about, like part breaking. But those are the 5 updates and improvements I wanted to talk about. It's been really nice to learn more about why these changes have come to the series and how the devs of Monster Hunter have been transparent with what they're doing, and then seeing the Stories team do the same. It gives important context to the changes and helps me get behind them. What are your thoughts on it anyway? How have you found the demo? Until next time though, I've been Hollow, you've been you, and thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.